took my...
I just took someone else's coffee.
Yeah, you took my coffee.
Sorry, I drank it.
Oh, it's okay.
Sorry about that.
You needed the coffee?
Wow.
I was wondering why you're taking my coffee.
It's one thing, then drinking.
Thought maybe you were just putting it up for a second.
Drinking someone else's coffee.
It's pretty good coffee.
Do you want your seat back?
Okay. Yeah, I'm good here. So it's a blessing.
Should we do a full-on review here, or just keep going a little bit? All right, let's do a little review. Does anyone have your copies still? Or
We have the copies, but
no copies?
We have it.
All right, so basically, I'm going to hold off on the original questions because they're really. We'll review those when we answer them, like in a few days. Hopefully before you test Kislev, although it's getting a little shaky there. But we started off by saying that. So basically, starting in Os Gimel, when we started going into the Inyanim, there's not too many Inyanim. We said there's the verse called Yoducha Hashem kol masech v'chasidecha yivrachucha, which means all of your creations, all of your deeds will thank you or acknowledge you, and chasidecha yivrachucha, your chasidecha will bless you. So yivrachucha, we said, is yivrachu ko, which means they will, ko represents malchus, and yivrachu ko means they'll be able to draw something down into malchus. Who's able to do that? Chasidecha, specifically the chasidecha, this category of tzaddikim. What is it that they're drawing down into ko? So it says Yoducha Hashem kol ma'asecha, this level which most of the creation can merely acknowledge, which is basically because it's beyond comprehension, all you can do is acknowledge it, which goes on the Or Ein Sof. Yeah, so Yoducha Hashem kol ma'asecha, that level which all of your ma'asecha can merely acknowledge, Chasidecha yivarachu, your Chasidecha can draw it down and even into ko, even all the way down into Malchus. Do you get that? So this is this unique. What's so unique about this? To understand that, you have to understand the difference between what? Two things. Bracha and tefillah. Behaving yourself? Okay. And bracha and tefillah. So each one has a maila over the other one. Bracha, the maila is about bracha that you can command a bracha. In other words, someone who has the brachas can just give them at will, and not only give them, but he can make them come out, because he's standing in a place which is higher than the source of the brachas. That's why he is able to sort of access them at will. And that's why we find when you give a bracha, you say it in a way of command. You should be blessed. So the quality there is that it's an automatic avadai. The quality about tefillah is that even something which was not, so to speak, in the pipeline, it didn't exist yet, even in the will of Hashem, you can change the will of Hashem and make something new. And that's why we find that the nusach of tefillah is yehi ratzon. So you're making basically a new will for Hashem. May there be a will, because up until this point there wasn't a will. So to make a new will for Hashem, you have to go higher than the whole Seder Ishtalshlus, because it doesn't exist yet. The idea of a bracha is that the concept exists, it's just it's stuck somewhere, and you need the blesser to draw it down for you. By giving you the bracha, he can command it to come down. But he's not commanding something to come into existence all out of nowhere. He's basically just dealing with something which already is in existence and commanding it to come down. But he doesn't have the power to create something anew. Whereas the inyan of a bracha, it's not always going to be answered, right? Tefillah. It's not always going to be answered, but should it be answered, what you're accomplishing is you're creating something brand new, which didn't exist in the whole Seder Ishtalshlus before. You're accessing there for a higher place, something beyond the source of bracha, and that's basically the Or Ein Sof. So the chiddush of Chasidecha Yivarachucha comes together in the fact that they are able to combine the Maila of Tefillah and the Maila of Bracha into one person. Right? That even though they're dealing with a level of Yoducha, which is a level which is the place where Tefillah reaches, it's a place which is only acknowledgeable and incomprehensible, it cannot be grasped by anybody because it's the Or Ein Sof. So that's what it says, Yoducha Hashem kol maasecha, this level which we can only acknowledge, Chasidecha yivarachucha. The Chassid can take dafka from that level and give it in a way of bracha. Which means he can basically summon something from non-existing entity, from a non-descriptive place, and bring an entirely new will into existence and send it down with an absolute certainty and give a blessing with it. That's his chiddush. He has both of these things. We then added one more detail, that all this is based on a mimer from the Rebbe Rashab, and he said that in the description of this, Rebbe Rashab goes one step further to talk about the way that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was able to make it rain by saying a pasuk in Tehillim, Matovu ohalecha, no, not Matovu, Umanayim Goraleinu, no.
Oh, that song.
L'chaim, l'chaim. Hine Matov Manayim Sheves Achim Gam Yachad. Thank you very much.
He just said that and it rained? Why can't we
Isn't that
do it?
unbelievable?
But isn't it the same words that we're saying if
Yeah,
he
but
says it?
it's coming from a different source.
But he's
It's
decided.
versus you or me. That's the difference.
Yeah, he
It's
was
like a
saying
different frequency?
he said a drasha also along with it, but yeah, that's basically what that's right. He did that. That's why you got to stay in your
Why don't we
sheet.
get
Maybe
a
you'll be able to do that
Why
one
don't we
day.
get a we get a computer?
Oh, you can do a lot more than that.
Yeah, we get a computer that will say it in every possible frequency that
Make it
exists
rain.
rapidly, and one of those will make it rain, and we'll know which frequency.
So the chiddush over there was that keep dreaming, kid. So the chiddush over there was that he wasn't even talking. He wasn't giving a bracha, right? So he didn't even have to bless. He wasn't giving a gezerah. He wasn't decreeing anything. He was giving a dvar Torah, and the dvar Torah b'chlal wasn't even about rain. So we find that there's a little bit of an extra something that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had that is brought in the Maimer to explain what does it mean Chasidech Yivarchucha, to show that the Chasidech Yivarchucha actually even had that quality. In other words, unlike all the other Tanaim and the Amoraim, who also had the power of doing all kinds of wondrous things and changing nature and decreeing things that were not yet in the pipeline and having them happen, like the story that's brought in this Maimer about Pinchas ben Yair, that he told the river to split, river Ganai, Chalok li meimecha, and it did. And we see that it was in the koach of his Torah learning, that because of he was one of the Tanoim, and he had this devekis with the Orein Sof, with the Torah, he, like others, were able to make decrees upon the world, which seems like the Inyan of Chasidech Yivarchucha. Basically, the river had argued with him and said, I'm doing the will of my Maker, leave me alone, which means that it was already decreed by Hashem that the river should do one thing, and it was fulfilling that will, so he undid that and made a new will by Hashem. So that's also the chiddush of Chasidech Yivarchucha, seemingly. He's able to command a change in Hashem's will, like he decrees and Hashem has to listen, kind of thing. Nonetheless,
He had a
he
conversation
was.
with the river?
Yes, he did. Nonetheless, he was.
What voice did the river sound like?
I think it might have been that only he.
Maybe it sounded...
It might have been that only he heard. He heard the voice. I don't think everybody around him heard it. But
Probably like a black guy. You know? Like, what's up, yo? Sorry, go on. Continue. You brought it up. You brought it up.
Welcome back, Yom Tov.
You told me there's a talking river.
Come on now. So we were saying is that even though he had this power, he had to nonetheless decree something about the river. In other words, he still had to give an actual gezerah and command something about the river. And the uniqueness of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai again is that he was not talking about anything to do with rain. He was just purely saying divrei Torah, and it rained, and his request was fulfilled. So we didn't explain all the details of it yet, but apparently that is more uniquely the level of Chasidech Yivarchucha, that the real Chasidech Yivarchucha is on a level he doesn't even have to command. Okay. So we went further to explain that there's what levels are being drawn into Malchus here. And we discussed the idea of the difference between tzedakah and gemilus chasadim in order to understand exactly what it means to give chesed, the chasidecha. The unit of a chassid is someone who's mischasidim kono. Right? He's able to do chesed with his kono. And without going into that whole class, we had a long class about that. I'm not going into that right now. Look in your notes. But mischasid im kono, it means in a short, it means he does chesed with his nest. And what is the nest? We said is malchus. So the idea is that why is he called a chassid? Because he does chesed with malchus. So then we would say, okay, so this whole big revelation that he's bringing down this wonderful thing into malchus is called chesed. Okay, it makes sense. He's a chassid. But what exactly is chesed is that there's a difference between chesed and tzedakah. Tzedakah is specifically shaykh to the poor, which means you can't give tzedakah to the rich, because the second you do, it stops being called tzedakah. It's impossible to do such a thing. It's a non-entity. You can only give, it's only called tzedakah when it's given to someone who's poor. And even if that person's poverty is that he was accustomed to being rich, and you just make him the rich like he was before, so in other words, it doesn't have to be that the person winds up is actually like a pauper. In other words, he could be just middle class, but he's poor because he's used to being like upper class. It's still called tzedakah. Give tzedakah to fill someone's lack. That's the idea.
So you could be a millionaire and receive.
Basically, the laws of tzedakah are interesting in that way. It says that dai machsura asher yachzer lo. You have to give him sufficient of his lacking, that which is lacking to him. So it says even a sus and a eved l'ratz lefanav. You have to give him even a horse and a servant to run in front of him. Someone who has a horse and a servant to run in front of him is not. I mean, even a good guy might not have a servant to run in front of him. But this guy, if that's what he's lacking, that's what you have to give him. That being said, it still only brings you to a certain level where you no longer lack. But rich is something else. Rich is that you don't just not lack, you have abundance. Okay? And so, the idea when it comes to spheros and lamaila is that the world itself can be in a state where you merely fill its lack, or the world can be in a state where you actually make it rich. And what does it mean to fill its lack? So the idea is that Ata asisa mas hashamayim, right? What did we say that was the ata asisa hashamayim? What was the limud from that, if you recall? Anyone remembers? Leiza.
Like Asian mime?
The word it came from the word ata.
What is it? How does it translate exactly?
With a hey,
Nice.
right? So the word ata asisa es hashamayim is written in these Tehillim without a hey, the word ata, even though of course you spell the word at, it's not at, it's ata, and the way you read it is ata, but the way it's written is at. So what does it come to teach us, Al Pi Kabbalah? That when Hashem created the heavens, He removed hey, what?
5 parzufim.
5 parzufim.
Nice.
Right? And what does it mean 5 parzufim? Malchus, Zah, Bina, Chochmah, and Keser. Meaning what? In order to make the world exist, so to speak, without being nullified inside of all of Hashem's light, He had to remove every aspect of light except for Malchus of Malchus, like the most external aspect, in order to enable like the Kelim to exist independently and not be nullified from all this light. Even the smallest measure, even Malchus, the parts of Malchus, if it would have stayed in the creation, it would not have looked like He wanted it to. So He had to remove 5 parzufim of light, including Keser. And what's the chiddush about Keser? Is that Keser is mamash above the world. And nonetheless, it's considered part of the world in that it really belonged to the world. It was part of the Shemayim, and He had to remove it in order to make it come and like sort of have a private existence, which means it has every shaykhus to the world. And therefore, when He'll return those 5 parzufim to the world, in other words, there'll be levels of divine revelation that will come back into His world after He makes it. None of those 5 parzufim, when they return, is called chesed, but only merely tzedakah. Because really they belong to the world, they were lacking from the world, and when He gives them back to the world, He's merely filling a lack.
Is this just like the example that He gives to explain chesed?
This is not the example of chesed. This is the example of tzedakah.
Sorry, to explain tzedakah. He's just
Yeah.
use that to explain tzedakah.
I mean, he's using that not only to explain tzedakah. I mean, you could explain tzedakah in simpler examples. He's using that to explain tzedakah and to introduce
Chesed.
ultimately what are the different levels of lights that are able to draw down into the world. So he starts off with that fifth level of keser. Even that is already shaykh to malchus in a certain sense. It's not. It doesn't make malchus rich. It's only merely giving tzedakah to malchus. It's just filling her lack. In other words, first of all, let me just stop there. Does anyone have any questions on what we just said and what I'm talking about, or is everything clear?
I was gonna say, what
I missed the middle part.
Okay.
You start over.
Yeah, but the best way to understand the middle is to understand the end. So we'll get back to you.
Oh, good point.
No, but we'll get. Hold on, let me just, because you weren't here for the whole when we did this, but
You don't really have to start over.
I figured as much. Anyone have any questions on that? Levi, you're good?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so that's called tzedakah, because basically, even though it's a lot of light that's being given to the world, even the light of keser, which is seemingly above the world, but it's that aspect of outer worldly light which is still shaykh to the world. So giving it back to the world is still just meeting her lack, and that is all called tzedakah. So then chesed therefore would be what? Making her rich, giving her something which was not even shaykh to her bichlal. It's not even in the realm of something that she was ever lacking. She never knew she was missing it. She was good to go. And what's that? So even though we said there's 5 parzufim, really there's 6. Because the 5th one, keser, that's called arich. The lower part of keser is the 5th one. There's a 6th part of keser. There's a second level to keser, which is the 6th parzuf, which is called atik. And in general, we say that arich is the highest part of the creation, and atik is the lowest part of the creator. And when you talk about giving chesed to malchus, that means you're going to give atik into malchus, because it's something which is not shaykh to the world at all, and the world can be perfectly fine without it. Okay, and even in its source, in its fullest measure, it already didn't have it, and therefore when you give it, it's called giving something. It's already called giving. It's called giving chesed. It's not called giving tzedakah anymore.
It was there, but it didn't have it.
It was never.
I think it was there.
No, but it was never there in relationship to the world.
Okay.
It was never something that the world lacked.
Okay.
Right? So now that you're going to give it to the world, you're giving something that the world never lacked. And that's called chesed. It's not filling a lack, it's giving something that was called abundance. Okay, but now there's yet another level. Because when it says that tzedakah is given to the poor and chesed is given bein la'aniyim, bein la'ashirim, whether to the poor, whether to the rich, that means to say that even someone who's rich can already get chesed. Which means there's a third level now, which is something, we sort of just brushed on this. You okay, Ariel?
Yeah.
Come home. There's you going to wake up the other guys? There's a third level, which we haven't really gone into yet, but we're sort of introducing it right now, which is even beyond atik. And the idea is that if you're able to give something to the poor and you're able to give something to the rich, so we discussed, what does it mean to give something to the rich? If the person is rich, and you give him more rich, and that makes him richer, then really, he wasn't rich to begin with. He was rich, but he wasn't truly rich. Because the second a person can receive more riches and it makes him richer, it meant that previously he had a lack. It doesn't mean his lack made him fit for tzedakah. He wasn't poor. But the fact that his rich was a relative richness which could be increased means he was not truly rich. A person who's truly rich has everything. So if you...
Boat?
Huh?
Like a boat?
Like a boat has everything?
No, like someone who's rich has a boat.
Yeah, but there's different kinds of boats, right? So the idea is like we say about Shlomo Hameleck, basically, that silver was worth nothing in his day. In other words, even the fanciest, finest boat, in other words, if you have literally $1 trillion, there's nothing you can't buy. And there's not a country you can't buy. There's not an army you can't buy. There's no more making you richer. It doesn't matter. Another $1 trillion won't really make you richer because there's nothing more you can buy with another $1 trillion that you can't buy now. Okay, so let's say you had 100. I don't know. What is 100 trillion?
That's the thing. You keep wanting more.
No. But there is a certain point where it becomes meaningless, and that's what they say about Shlomo Hameleck.
Really?
Silver was like dirt in his days. You could take silver, pieces of silver, and just throw it in the river. Like you could patch your
jeans with it.
patch your jeans with it.
The whole day, no one had a laugh.
Basically, I don't know. That's like I don't know one individual. But I think that's also true. But like for example, Shlomo Hameleck himself, there's just simply nothing more that money could buy. Right? Nothing more than money could buy. So he was rich. But now, so that's called, now what is chesed then? Here's the point that we're trying to get to. What is chesed? If you can give something to the poor and the rich alike, that means it's not just more money you're giving him. It must be some new breed of someone that is completely out of his dimension, that he wouldn't even perceive that such a thing would even be something that he could receive. In order to give him something, because again, it's not just giving him more relative wealth. That means he wasn't truly wealthy to begin with. We're talking about a person who has reached the pinnacle of wealth, and even him you can give, because it says you can give chesed to the rich, and we're talking about a full, truly rich man, which means he lacks absolutely nothing, even in the realms of richness.
It's gotta be something.
And still you can give him something. So when you're talking about giving him this thing, it's something we don't even know what you're talking about, basically.
Something beyond
Material.
Could
Something
it
that's
be
not
something-
material.
It must be something not material, it must be something beyond.
Right.
And that's the point. But we're talking about, remember, don't lose ourselves. We're talking about what you can give to Malchus. So filling its gap, which is giving it tzedakah, is called arich. Okay? Making it rich is called atik. Because it's something that it's not even refilling a lack. When you give it atik, the sixth parzuf, you're not filling any lacks because it never lacked that to begin with. You're just giving it abundance, and obviously you're giving it the fullness of abundance. You're giving it atik, right? And then there's an ability to give something to rich and poor alike, and we haven't really discussed what that is yet. But I'm just sort of like opening up that window for us right now. And in this, we started talking about Shlomo Hameleck, basically. And we're about to be caught up to where we left off. Which is Ches, exactly. So what we were basically saying, let's just quickly, the last one we didn't do yet is Zayin. We did say, that he was holding by Atik, Shlomo Hameleck was holding by Atik, and why? Because Shlomo Hameleck represented the fullness of the moon, right? Shlomo was the 15th generation after Moshe, which means the world, the idea of the moon represents Malchus, and the moon was full. So what does it mean full? That over and above the fact that it had its 5 parzufim met, that it was no longer lacking, it was also rich. Shlomo Hameleck drew down richness. Where do we see this? That Baruchnius Ubagashmius, the world has never been so rich before nor after since. That we had the base of Mikdash, Ruchnius, we were like flying high, and as we said a moment ago, silver was worth nothing in his days. In other words, so we see that the world was not just not just filled its lack, but it was pashut rich in this 15th generation. Right? So Shlomo hit Atik, basically. He hit gold. And this represents, on a level of, just one last point. Yom Tov, no.
Let's get a tissue.
Oh, here's one.
Basically we said that it was really through him. If you recall, we started going off on a tangent about tzaddikim a little bit. It was through him that this revelation came. It wasn't just that he sort of like wound up in the 15th generation and therefore hit gold. It was a little bit of a mazel in his part that he happened to be the tzaddik of the 15th generation, but he was the tzaddik of the 15th generation. Like the Rabbi says about Moshe, Kol hashvin chavivin, all 7s are beloved. There's a certain mazel just coming in this. You fall into the 7th category, but at the same time, he was Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not like he was just. It just happened to him. He was the greatest man on earth. So too Shlomo Hameleck, and therefore all the revelation of the Or Ein Sof of Atik, it was him that was pouring out Atik in the world, and therefore David, his father, didn't build the Beis Hamikdash, even though he prepared it and so forth. He was the one who actually released this channel of Atik into the world through his self personally, and that's where everyone was flowing to his wisdom. What were they really flowing to? They were flowing to the Elokus, that was clearly present in him, like a torch that draws flames from surrounding candles. As we talked about, that a flame will jump off the wick of a candle to join a greater fire, so too all the sparks of Kedusha from all around the earth were flying into Shlomo Hameleck, because he was able to pull the godliness out of the klippas just because he lit such an awesome torch in his own person. And therefore all the people and all the wealth and all the intensity of godliness that had been trapped in the klippas for all those years was just flowing towards him because of his self.
Because of the chesed that was done to him. Basically.
The chesed that was done to him?
Or that he did, or that he got, or I mean, he got the reason why...
Actually, no. We're not talking about chesed yet. If you recall, chesed is something you give to rich and poor.
Right.
He represents rich. So we're not talking about chesed yet. He's not the level that we're shooting for.
Oh, we didn't say he had atik.
Atik, yes. But atik means you're rich.
I thought arich meant you're rich.
Arich means you're not poor. Arich is tzedakah.
Right.
No, I'm serious. Arich, you give
Arich
tzedakah to the poor.
Okay.
To make them not poor, but not to make them rich.
Yeah.
It's that dafka the command when it comes to tzedakah. You don't have to make him rich, right? So a person who receives tzedakah is befeirush. You don't give him enough to make him rich.
But the 5 parzufim left, and then when you get...
That's called tzedakah. He got more than that. He got atik even. So he was rich. Okay.
I thought if he gets more than what he's lacking, then it's chesed.
Well, but pay attention close to what we're saying is that chesed is something you can give to rich and poor alike. Which means that chesed is something you can even give to the rich, not to give to the poor to make him rich. Okay? You're right, there's something called poor, there's something called someone who's no longer poor. So that's a person who's received tzedakah. That's the world who got her 5 parzufim back.
Okay.
Then there's something called abundance. Right? How do you get abundance? You go get a job, I guess. No one's giving you abundance, okay? Basically, or you can get abundance, but it's not necessarily called chesed. It is called chesed. We're not sure. Maybe there's 2 levels of chesed, but the point is that once you have abundance, you're called rich. And that spiritually is called atik.
Oh.
Okay? That's the 6th parzuf, which is not shaykh to the world.
Okay.
But then there's something called gimilus chasadim. And the idea of giving on the level of chesed, it means you can give equally to the poor and to the rich. It's still called giving chesed when you give even to the rich, which means that there's a 3rd higher category which is shaykh to give even to the rich.
Because they don't know about it, and they don't know this dimension of...
So we said, yeah, it's like a higher dimension. Okay. So what we're saying regarding Shlomo is he represents the epitome of wealth, which is that, yes, he gathered atik, right? He had atik, and therefore he was wealth spiritually and physically. And this was his inyan. Okay.
He built the first Beis Mikdash, Shlomo?
Yeah. Yeah, it was built in his day.
So the
Okay.
What's that?
We'll go inside now for the beginning of the... That was a review.
Koheles. Okay, right. He's like a wise man.
The wisest.
Yes.
The wisest. The wisest.
He was the wisest man that ever lived. That's his claim to fame. Okay, going on Ches. Well, you will make copies, I guess, for tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
You guys lost all your copies.
Yes.
I see.
Come on, it's probably there.
I
They're
tried.
probably over there with your marbles.
Well, we lost those a long time ago. Marbles are long gone.
Okay, Ches. V'hine zeh sheshlomo haya ish manucha. We did not do this yet, right?
No.
No.
This is the good part.
We did? No.
This that
We
Shlomo
did.
was called a man of peace. Da'abiru shebiyamav, which means that the refinement that took place in his days, haya b'derech manucha, it was in a way of peace. The refinement of the world that he did, he was not a man of war. Shlo yatzrich l'milchama, he never went to war. He did not. I mean, he started off with like a little bit on a kamikaze mission there. He killed all his enemies like in a quick shot, and that was it. And that's what we have to learn from him. He just took care of all of his enemies. His father told him, you got to watch out for this guy, you got to watch out for this guy hurt me. And as soon as he took the reins, he just put out the death order on like about 10 guys, and he had peace for the rest of his life. Just take care of the problem. And the idea is that he didn't need to go to war with anybody. He didn't need war bichdei levarer es hanitzotzos, in order to get out the sparks of, you have everything in it has a spark of godliness in order to exist. But some things are a cow, some things are a pig. So in other words, the spark can be hidden. It can be very hidden. It looks like it could be elevated to godliness. It looks like it can't even ever be elevated to godliness. There's sparks. How do you get the spark out? So there's different ways. Sometimes you have to go fighting with the thing to get the spark out, and sometimes you don't. And he didn't have to. He was able to just coo the spark out by whispering in its ear, and the spark came to him.
Wow.
Well, everything has a spark, even something evil.
Otherwise, it can't exist, right? That's the idea that God is everywhere. There's nothing that exists except for God. So there's nothing that has just independence from Him, which means He's in it. Well, the part of Him that's, so to speak, in it, we call the spark of divinity.
I figured out a way of seeing the Muslims as good, which is kind of a
Okay, they've got their spark.
Yeah.
Elosh hanitzotzos. Yeah, we'll get to that. Elosh hanitzotzos nimshechu elav ma'atzma. These sparks were drawn to him all on their own. Shis barudu. So they wanted to get refined. Right? They basically came and knocked on the door and said, I heard that there's godliness to be found in these parts, and they basically wanted it. So how did he do this? He was a man of peace, in other words. He didn't have to fight with the objects in order to get the godliness out. How did he do it? We already sort of said it. It's because he created such a massive light that anybody that had a shred of light that can identify with light, which everybody can somehow identify with light, everybody has godliness in them. It's just that it's so hidden inside of themselves, right? That it's hard for them to sort of see it in their own selves. When you see something so light, so good, so, even the hardest man, he can cry, he has emotions, he can become sensitive, there's something in him which if it will be triggered from the outside, it will touch something upon himself in a very deep place that he'll break. So this is what Shlomo did to every man, basically. He created such love and light and warmth and holiness, and it called out from afar that everyone who had a shred of decency inside of them, which is basically everyone at the end of the day, they started crying, they started coming to him.
Wow.
And how did he do it? Basically, Bapashtus, it was the temple. That's what it was. People heard from far and near and far. There was godliness on the earth. Now that's in comparison to the refinement that took place through the miskan, through the portable temple in the desert, which we call the tabernacle. Kolel gam hagiloi sheheir ba'aron shaya b'mishkan. Okay, so he says the refinement that took place of the revelation in the Mishkan, including also the Giloi Sheheir Ba'aron, including the revelation of the Aron, of the ark that was in the Mishkan. In other words, the Mishkan and the sort of prized jewel of the Mishkan, the Aron, all of that refinement it was able to do, Haya b'derech milchama. It was in fact in a way of war. Why was it in a way of war? Because they had to go around basically with it fighting. We'll get to that in much more detail. Whereas the refinement of the world that took place through the Beis HaMikdash, it was in a way of peace. It didn't have to travel around. There was no fighting. He's going to explain all of this basically. But so we find basically there's a huge difference between, let's say, Moshe and Shlomo, where Moshe also had a tremendous effect on the world and refined the world in some kind of unbelievable way. But it was in a way of what we call war. Moshe was a warrior. Whereas Shlomo, and they both did it through the ark, basically. The ark went out with him to war, right? And whereas Shlomo, he did it through peace. Remember, this mimer is called Pada B'Shalom Nafshi. It's probably a good time to bring that up. It's the holy Indian of Yutes Kislev is, my soul is redeemed in peace. So it's an Indian of refining the world, maybe without having to go to war. Ki Rabbi Hayu Imadi. The masses were already with me. I didn't have to go fight with them. In other words, what was the story about David HaMelech? That his son was going against him in war, and all of his son's men really were on the side of David. It's very similar to what we're saying regarding Shlomo. It's like David was so holy that they sort of heard it broke these hard men, even though they were sort of like the warriors coming against him. he was able to trigger inside of them some softness in them that they were really with him. He didn't have to really fight them in a certain sense.
Like Yaakov Esav, when Yaakov met Esav.
100%. 100%. He like suddenly didn't have to go to war. Right? It's very true. Mamish.
So one of David's sons, that's the one who was trying to oust Solomon in the beginning and try to take over the throne.
What's your point?
Look, he had to fight his brother at first.
I said, like, he basically took out a few men.
Okay.
But I guess that's not called war. You know, they didn't actually chase after him. He wasn't on the run. He gave some executive orders and killed a few people. I don't think that's not called war. Apparently, the world was at peace in his days. Right? Hayashalom biyama. In other words, it was an unbelievable thing. It was 40 years of peace on earth. So it was literally no war in the world. Anyway, going on. So Kedeisa B'Zohar, it says in the Zohar, Train inun havuda amru kuma Hashem. There was two people in history that said kuma Hashem, rise Hashem. Who were they? Moshe and David. Moshe said kuma Hashem vayafutzu oivecha. Right, we say it when we open the Torah. He said, rise Hashem vayafutzu oivecha, and may your enemies be scattered. V'David amar kuma Hashem limnuchasecha. And David said, rise Hashem to your limnuchasecha, to your peace, to your rest, to your comfort. I'm not sure exactly how you would translate that.
To your offerings also maybe.
Kuma Hashem limnuchasecha. It's like how would you translate that? It's funny in English. Rise to your tranquility. Okay. I like that. Very good. In other words, that's good. Okay. Umavur ba'amaimer. So it says in the Maimer, what does it mean? Two people said kuma, rise. This that the Mishkan and the Aron were going through the desert. Why were they going? Right? The whole thing, it's talked about in Maimari Chasidis, Parshas Naso, in particular, the beginning there, the first Maimar, that whole concept is dealt with very, very beautifully. He says that the traveling through the desert, in other words, why Hashem just needed them to like schlep around. It's like it's a weird thing, you know. First of all, they didn't even go that many places. Rashi goes on and says they didn't even travel all that much. In 40 years, they traveled something like 20 times or something. So what was the whole thing about, really? Is they were going through the desert in order to nullify the klippas that were in the desert. The desert was a place of snakes and scorpions, horrendous snakes and scorpions, like giant-sized snakes and scorpions. And everywhere they went, they leveled the mountains, they raised the valleys, they killed all the snakes and scorpions, and in place of it, they made like a flourishing garden with Miriam's well and started to blossom plants and everything. And this was what they were doing. They were subduing the desert. The desert represents a place where man cannot dwell. Who is man? Man represents the man that sits on the chariot above. Godliness is man. And the desert is a place where man cannot dwell and nothing grows, a place of klippa. And they turned it into a flourishing garden. So that was basically transformation of the klippas into kedusha. That was the whole journey of the desert. Nachashim, srafim, v'akravim, the snakes and scorpions, to nullify them, ulevaru la'alosis and nitzotzos to kedusha shenaflu sham, and to elevate the holy sparks that fell there. In other words, every snake, every scorpion, every mountain, every valley, it's also made by God. But the godliness in it is hidden and concealed. Instead of showing something which looks like God, it shows a concealment of God. They took out the spark with the Aron. They had like this powerful weapon. And they were able to suck out the ark or fight with the thing until the snake coughed up its nitzots, and they were able to elevate the sparks that were in the desert. And by the way, had they not done that, the whole world would not be what it was. It wasn't just like they weren't just like sort of having a temporary battle. That was written in the Torah, which is eternal, because it was a sort of one-time thing that they had to do in order to make it be able to go into Eretz Yisrael and make us able to do mitzvahs the way we do. In other words, they weren't just doing it in that desert for that time. The desert in that time represented a certain like presence and residence of a certain level of evil in the world that holy generation had to wipe out in order for the rest of the process of history to unfold. So they did it sort of like for once and for all mankind. That's why they needed Moshe Rabbeinu and Mamash the Ark and everything. And basically, hu biru b'derech milchama. That is nonetheless called refining the world, yes, but in a way of war. They had to literally fight with every place that they came into encounter with. Just like the analogy of a king that goes out of his place, he has to leave his palace and go into enemy territory in order to fight with the enemy, in order to fight with him and to conquer him. Right, so this is what it was. They weren't in Eretz Yisrael. They weren't on Har Sinai. They weren't in the holy place. They had to go into the enemy land. They had to go into the Midbar Amim, right? This like ferocious, horrible place that no one would ever dream of going into, right? It's like when the Jews fled into the Midbar, they were like laughing at them. They're like, okay, you want to run away into like the desert of evil and hell? But be my guest. You're not going to last very long in there, you fools, you know? Because no one ever went there. It was like the ferocious desert that like man had never wanted to deal with. So they went into literally enemy territory of like pure evil, and they, like a person who goes to war has to go into the enemy territory. You go into Nam, baby. Yeah.
I wonder if we can say the same thing with like Golos and Gula. Like Golos is like Golos is maybe like going out to war.
Yeah.
Like,
well, it depends. It depends. There's ways of being in Gullus where, but yeah, ultimately yes. Like when you're in Eretz Yisrael,
yeah, you're
not in enemy territory, right?
Yeah.
V'lechein Amar Moshe. Therefore, Moshe said, "V'nogea l'nesias ha'aron b'midbar." Therefore, he said regarding the traveling of the Aaron in the desert, "Vayihi bin so'aron." He would say, and we say it also when it would go and travel in the when the Aaron traveled, Kuma Hashem vayafutz oivecha. That's why he said this business about go scatter your enemies, because he was in enemy territory, and it was war time. The yeshnam oivim, and there's enemies shetzich lilchom b'hem, and you have to go fight with them. Whereas the birur al yidei agilu shaheir beis hamikdash, but the refinement that took place through the revelation that's shown in the Beis Hamikdash, Haya b'derech manucha, it was in a way of rest. Nobody went to war. Shlomo didn't even get his clothes dirty. Shlomo had min komo. He sat in his place on his throne. Vanitzotzos nimshecho elav me'atzom. All the enemies came to him, bearing gifts, bearing women, bearing conversions. They were just ready to give it all over to Shlomo. He didn't have to go anywhere. The enemy came to you. It's much nicer. A world of peace. You didn't have to fight with anybody. There was no wars in his whole day. Few people got killed in the beginning. That was it. Let's just have 40 years of no enemies. It's pretty good. And that explains the difference in the language. David, of course, was the lead-in generation. David, of course, had lots of war, but he was already setting the stage for Kuma Hashem limnuchasecha. Rise, Hashem, to your tranquility. There's no need for war. The ark does not have to go into enemy territory. It's safe at home. Ulaha'ir, and to clarify, that in every place we explain. That the okay, so this is going to like sort of frame this conversation a little bit complicated. So he says, what's going on here? Everywhere else we explain that the refinement that was going on through the Aaron traveling in the desert, we usually say that was a refinement in a way of peace. In other words, what? Usually when we talk about this topic, and he brings a few places at the bottom, a few different Maimarim, we say that when they traveled in the desert, it was called a refinement in a way of peace. The exact opposite of what we're saying now. What are you talking about? How could that possibly be called a way of peace? Like Shlomo we're saying, but in the desert they called that the way of peace. Because hold on, when we talk about peace in those Maimarim, what we mean is that the refinement happened in a way what's called b'derech mamela, automatic refinement. Meaning what? The kaven the bittul klippas ubiron nitzotza shenaflu behem. Since the nullification of the klippas and the refinement of the sparks that fell into those klippas in the desert, haya al yedei gilu sheher b'mishkan. It really they were refined through the revelation that shown in the Mishkan. Haya b'derech mamela. It was automatic. In other words, when they took the Mishkan to the snakes, They didn't actually have to go out with swords to the snake. The Mishkan killed the snakes. So that's called automatic. That's called peaceful. L'chein gam habira shal yedei Aaron the Mishkan. Therefore, in a certain way, even the refinement that took place through the Aaron in the Mishkan was called a bira of manucha. It was also called peaceful relatively.
It's kind of funny. He's like arguing with them, like
He's arguing with the other Maimari.
Yeah.
But he's not arguing, he's just clarifying a point. He's
yeah.
saying that basically we're seeing there's two levels of peace.
But there were a lot of wars also with Amalek and all the other guys. So,
There were wars also. It's true. But when we describe that in the desert, he's talking about specifically this particular thing that, in other words, when he said all this idea of Kumashon v'yafutz v'yevecha, that was mostly when they were traveling the desert. That's when that in Parshas Naso, I think, also when he goes around, he says, go here, go there. That wasn't when they were particularly fighting with anybody. Probably at the end, when they fought with Sichon Nog, he might have said the same thing. Maybe not. But the whole idea of Kum Hashem and Vayafutz V'Evecha is kind of strange, actually. Like, what are you talking about? They weren't fighting all those 40 years, right? So what were they fighting? They were fighting the Klippas, and then, so therefore it was a fight. So it wasn't a fight, it was a fight. In another place it says it was also in a way of peace. So what we're saying is like this, it was a relative peace. They would go into the land of the Klippas, but the ark would do their fighting for them. They didn't actually have to fight anybody. So in a certain sense, it was an automatic refinement. So it was a peace compared to taking out your swords. But it was a war compared to Shlomo, where they didn't even have to go into the territory of the enemy.
Okay, he's clarifying.
So he's clarifying. Aval amisi's inyan manucha, the true level called manucha, shemavaru eino yored l'makam hamizbaru, is that the refiner does not need to go into the place of the the one who needs refining. Ela nimtza b'mkoma, but he rather just, the refiner just stands in his place, v'ayde gilei or da'mevaru, and just by revealing the light of the refiner, shemeir al hamizbaru, that it shines to the one needing refining, like from afar, who nimshach me'atzulah mizbarer, he's drawn on his own to the refiner, okay, period. And that's called true peace. So we're seeing that there's now three levels. There's mamish war, there's going into the enemy's land and not really fighting with them, which is called a relative level of peace. And then there's staying home and watching the enemy come to you, and that's total peace. So there's three levels of refinement going on here. Okay, we'll hold here. Shkoyach, shkoyach.
Gotta go make the minion over there.
Make the minion.
Accurate.
Wait, you're going to go make the minion?
That's Tzemach
They
Tzedek.
started at 8:30. You missed the minion.
No, it's not 8:30.
Oh, I
And
said
by the time I get
think
there,
it's 9:30.
they won't have a minion.
Oh, okay.
Trust me.
Cool too.
Okay.
That feels
Sacred
good. Don't stop.
Hamorim
You should come to
Mevukot.
the new place we have and visit.
What's this, Vav?
That's nice.
You think we're gonna finish it before you discuss?
We're getting pretty far there, I'd say. There's a possibility.
Now we can make the whole.